What we are about to do is share with the community who is all about making measurement and evaluation easier, a fun opportunity. I did a study about 2 years ago now, just 40 informal conversations with global learning leaders, and I found 3 common challenges to measuring the impact of learning in organizations or communities. And the number, it wasn't 1, 2, or 3, it was within the 3, I can't remember now, but we weren't designing learning to facilitate change. That was the biggest barrier to evaluating impact. And so if we don't build our muscle facilitating learning that changes behaviors, then we won't get to the impact side of things. And so that's what this opportunity is all about. So Chris, my first question for you as we frame this opportunity, why is it so important that we focus on behaviors in learning and development?
Yeah, thanks so much, Elena. I've been looking forward to this. It's a great audience, great people. There's a fundamental question that drives a decision here, because the question is, why does behavior change matter? The question I would pose back is, does it matter? And in some cases, it absolutely will, and in other cases, it won't. And the fundamental baseline question here is, are you being tasked with delivering training or driving change?
Everyone listening to this video will be very familiar with the work back perspective. And that's something that I do believe the Kirkpatrick model helps us and has instilled in our industry, the thinking of, if we want to get to behavior that changes performance, that then influences positive growth for the business, we've got to work backwards from the business goal to the performance that we want to see, and then those micro level behaviors that support the performance that we want to see inside of an organization. So our opportunity here, because we have to take small micro steps, we can't change the world in one case study, and so we start somewhere. So the opportunity is to take a content block. So imagine something no more than 2 hours that is probably in the ballpark of like 80% or 90% like instructor led. And we want to distill that into what's the behavior focused, and then how might we change the delivery based on identifying those behaviors. Did I frame that right, Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to take, yes, exactly what you said. And then we're going to do it in 2 parts, really. It's around clarifying the behaviors that we want to work on, and then structuring the, really providing a step stool for learners as they're leaving the session, so that it's not, be a better leader, which is a great intention, but not a behavior change. How do we take it down to something, a lot of BJ Fogg's influence in how we structure commitments, and really working into those tiny habits, right? What's the daily practice that we can establish? And I just actually, before we move on from that, we were having a really great LinkedIn exchange with you, me, and another one of your colleagues or guests around, and this is gonna be fun to dig into, but behavioral themes, I believe, can be prescribed and designed to. The specifics of the commitment needs to be owned by the individual. So how do we balance that tension between participant taking ownership for crafting the commitment, while appreciating that they're not behavior change experts? So how do we provide them some structure and guidance to make that a quick and efficient process, and also increase the likelihood of their success? So that's what we're going to get into. What's insidious about the L&D space, or historically at least, is that the way that we've measured success on a program doesn't take into account whether people are applying it, right? We're looking at smile sheets, we're looking at knowledge retention, we're looking at the things that say that people had a great time in the room and they filled their head with some stuff, but we don't actually know if they applied it. And so that's really been my obsession for now 16 years, is how do we support that change and measure it in a way that's beneficial to the individual and the organization?
Well, we are in the right space with the right audience and the right time. What's so crazy, Chris, is your passion, my passion, all of our listeners, we all want to do learning that has long-term impact, that actually is applied, whether it's on the job, inside of organizations, or in communities.
Yeah.
And yet for years, I believe there's some debate on this, but I believe 1930 is one entry point where some practitioner said, hey, we should be measuring and designing
for the application of learning in the real world. And then there's, definitely like 1969 or 1972, something like that. There's another practitioner who wrote a whole bunch of stuff on like why we should be focused in this area. And it's 2024 almost. And we're still really struggling with this area. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's a lot of content we could dig into. But one key thing in particular is essential for us in making that impact happen. Chris, from your perspective, what is that challenge that we have to overcome?
I mean, it sounds incredibly basic, but behavior change needs to happen. Mm-hmm. We need learners to actually take the learning and put it into practice, not once, but in a way that creates lasting change for them, their teams, and their organizations.
We're here to talk about how do we translate a content focus to a behavior focus. And You've got a process for us.
There's really three questions. So what I'm sort of working through verbally is something we call the impact value chain. You referenced the Kirkpatrick Phillips model or Kirkpatrick model. For those who are familiar with it, you know that we start with participant satisfaction as sort of the lowest level, then knowledge retention, then behavior change, business impact, and ROI. When we think about it through the lens of stakeholders inside the organization, what an executive team really cares about is business impact and ROI, right? Like their job is to make financially responsible decisions around how to advance those two things. And if they're doing their job well, that's that from like they can have a heart and they can care about developing people, and still their mandate is to drive those two things. Okay. Most L&D HR departments are measuring participant satisfaction and knowledge retention. So there's a complete misalignment there. And we wonder why HR gets relegated, right, from the senior leadership table, which is a conversation for another day. Behavior change, that level 3, for me is really the bridge. When we do behavior change well, we can speak to both audiences and we can connect the dots between the two. So the reason I mention that is that the impact value chain, which is sort of our actionable or applicable take on the Kirkpatrick Phillips model, says that we want to understand that from the executive team's mindset, there are strategic priorities that are driving every decision they're making this year. Hopefully, if they're doing their job properly. And those strategic priorities usually involve achieving things that they haven't achieved before, which means that we need people that are doing things differently than we've done before. And as an executive team, we have two options then. We can either buy that capability, i.e. hire people, or we can build it, i.e. train and develop our people. If we assume that we're going to build it, train and develop people, then we want to go to the next layer and say, okay, we understand that we need, more effective leaders at driving delegation and whatever, something in there. What does that actually look like? Like, what's a tangible daily example of that? And we end up with behaviors, a list of behaviors, all of which stems from the strategic priorities, right? So we're still anchored to that. And then saying, okay, if these are the behaviors that we need, what's the fastest and most cost-effective way to get those behaviors happening, to achieve those new competencies or cultural norms, to advance our strategic priorities? That's where we get to the training, right? I've often joked or said that your client doesn't actually want training, right? And the test on that is that if they could plug in sort of Matrix style and just download Kung Fu, then they'd do that, right? They wouldn't invest in the training; they'd invest in the outcome for things we want change to happen. So I appreciate that may feel like a bit of a step back from where we're going on the tactics, but I think it's important that we keep that top of mind when we are getting into design of programs to drive behavior change, is that we're working from one end of the spectrum to the other. The executive team is typically working in reverse, right? They're starting from strategic priorities. So if you have sightline to what the strategic priorities are and can work hand in glove with them, then that becomes quite effective. The Evelyn example, the client said, we want a leadership program. She said, okay, why? Like, what do you mean? We want to develop our people. Like, right. But let's assume that this program is a wild success. This is question number 2. Let's assume that this program is a wild success. How are people acting, feeling, interacting differently as a result of this program? When you ask this question and start getting the client's top of mind response, first of all, it's easy for them to answer. Usually they don't need to go find data somewhere. They understand it. So they can give you some, like, here's what it would look like. Great. What we're really doing in there is we're identifying things that they say that are behaviors, and we're identifying things that are competencies or cultural norms. So it's circle 2 and 3. once we have an understanding of what good looks like on the other side of this program with them, and what Evelyn did was saying, okay, so why does that matter? This client was listing off things like, they'll have greater delegation skills. They'll be more empathetic to their hires. They'll have a greater degree of accountability to themselves, each other, and their teams. Okay, great. Why does that matter? Well, then they drop the bomb. Well, because our turnover is 60% higher than industry norm, and it's costing us about $7 million a year. Okay, so one of the strategic priorities probably is to reduce that $7 million hole in their P&L. And now everything that Evelyn's designing is around that. Evelyn, for context, had been a leadership consultant for 35 years. She's got months of content. But rather than pick her favorite pieces of content, she's now going, okay, what are the specific pieces of content that are going to move those specific behaviors that are going to, right, move the needle on what matters most?
One other thing you mentioned that I want to ask a follow-up question on, because, you're asking, what would success, if we were wildly successful, what does that look like? What would people be doing differently? What's that change? And then what's the most cost-effective way to get to that change? And you and I probably both know, and I don't believe that training is always the right solution. Like sometimes it's, we need job aids, or we need more mentorship, or we need people to shadow other people to see like expectations and set expectations for how to do their jobs. There's a lot of other things that can be put in place that aren't a formal training program. And I just wouldn't want to skip over that. I think if we can find a more cost-effective way that is not a training program, that's kind of like the first question. Is it inspiration or change? Next one, do we need training, or could we do it more cost effectively with some other intervention? So we've got now the third, well, maybe it's third or fourth question in your process, but we just left off with, okay, if we're wildly successful, what would people be doing differently? Organizing those responses into a couple different categories: behavior, skills, competencies, and then why does that matter? And getting down to ultimately what it sounds like is dollars and cents. We're saving money somewhere, or we're building revenue from some other place. What happens next?
The core message on all of it to me is to connect what you're doing to the existing sort of hierarchies and structures of business data, right? So exactly to your point, if closing more calls, not sales, but calls, is the metric we're going to tie to, they already know how it leads, right? You don't need to reinvent the wheel on that. But it's getting outside of the L&D bubble of saying people love this session. Like, who cares, right? Like, I'm glad. I'm genuinely glad. And how do I justify that investment moving forward? We're probably approaching about 4 or 5 million data points now on what makes behavior change stick following learning sessions. So a couple of the key things that I see as common mistakes or challenges. One is what I refer to as the content context ratio. So people need two things in order for change to happen, right? They need to understand how to do the change, like what do I do differently? And they need to have a strong enough reason to break inertia, right? Because we're all busy. That is best accomplished, we've found, with at least a 3-to-1 ratio between context and content. Meaning, if you're providing a 10-minute soundbite around a particular idea, in an ideal world, you'd want to allow at least 30 minutes of discussion, activity, exercise, where they are processing, hearing from others, and finding their own so what in order to actually want to put that into practice. So that's a key piece. Number one is, if you've got an hour session, you don't have an hour of content. You have 20 minutes or less, right? If you really want to maximize the impact of it. People go, I've got so much in there already. It's like, well, I know, but that's the problem. We're trying to pour an ocean through a straw, right? It comes back to the purpose. So that's number one. People are really bad at commitment setting in general, like exhibit A, New Year's resolutions, right? So we need to help them, protect them from themselves by taking that intention and translating it down into something that they can do daily. That's easier just to do than it is to justify not doing. And that is binary. I know if I did it or not, right? So it's not vague or ambiguous. And ideally, I said daily, but I want to double down on that. It should be ideally something that they can do on a daily basis. So, making a commitment around, when I'm in the Monday morning sales meeting, instead of sitting like a wallflower, I will speak up and share my opinion. Beautiful. And you're not going to build muscle around that very well, because it's only on a Monday and you're going to forget, because it's a while before next Monday. So let's take that intention and structure commitment and turn it into when I'm interacting with a colleague, right? So that it becomes something that I can do on a daily basis. So that becomes really key message number 2 is make it daily.
I want to say one thing, and that is the thing we're teaching people, the behavior that we want them to do is on the job or in real life. Sometimes, like you said, they don't do it every day, and we have to account for, the forgetting curve or whatever. But I love what you suggested, which is if I only get to practice this activity every Monday, because that's when I would use the skill, is in my Monday, when I lead my Monday meetings or when I'm in a Monday meeting, whatever. How do we then figure out as designers what are the things that could like complement that behavior, even if it's not directly doing the thing? And so that's I've not actually thought about complementary things to reinforce the change that we want people to be implementing. And what you're suggesting is let's not wait for a weekly reinforcement. Let's figure out what every day might be helpful, complementary to reinforce the ultimate behavior that we want to see. That to me is a big distinction with some of the other design models and approaches that I've heard.
Just to build up, because people will be leaving this going, yeah, how do you do that? Make the habit about noticing. Right? Or reflecting. So you could say at the end of the day, before I shut down my computer, I will reflect on the day and identify places where there could have been greater levels of inclusivity or something, right?
Yeah.
So you're building the muscle around awareness, if not around the specific action to call out. So that's supporting behavior, as you say.
Yeah, I love that.
Cool.
Great. What's our third thing?
Third thing is reflection and check-in. So when we're designing, so often, compare it to summiting Everest, you design for the event, which is the summit, right? And then I forget what the exact stat is, but something like 90% of the people that have died on Everest actually died on the way back down, not on the way up. Did you know this? I know. We're going to end on a high here, Elena. But the reason being is that, the psychology behind it is that they've been so mentally conditioned to the summit that then they make mistakes on the way back down because that wasn't the point. If the mental model shift is to summit Everest and return home safely, it changes the dynamic. Similarly, although not quite as intense, if the purpose is to deliver a great training and ensure that behavior change happens, we can shift our energy, our attention, some of our resourcing into the support of the learner following the session, group coaching conversations, email check-in, shameless self-plug, but a tool like Actionable, those types of things become a worthwhile and meaningful investment when the objective shifts from let's put everything into the event to let's put it into the sustainment activity.
Yeah. And I think it's so important that we understand realistically, like before we even design the program, how frequently will people be practicing the behavior and in what, like you said, context, in what context or environment, and then figuring out what are the things that might help or hinder that, and how do we support and reinforce that. So often we stop our measurement at the end of an event, and in reality, the event doesn't really mean anything so much as that people took the practice and the information from the event and they've applied it. So what we should really be measuring is at the frequency with which those behaviors are expected to take place. And then I love the piece of reflection. And if we know that someone is supposed to every Monday be doing this certain practice in their meetings, then we would have a nudge. And I'm sure Actionable builds that and makes that super easy. There would be a nudge that would prompt reflection, or maybe there would be an option to join your cohort. Hey, we have a optional meeting. It's been a month. You've had 4 times to practice every Monday. If you want to talk with other people who were in your learning community and learn best practices where they were stuck and reinforce and talk about it, that's huge and reinforcing in a really helpful way, not like a watch this video, you aren't doing the thing, right?
You get the bell curve of humanity, right? Change is hard. Some people are going to fall out of the gate. Other people are going to have major wins out of the gate. We want to normalize that and to lift up those that have stumbled out of the gate, because it almost doesn't matter how well the first one goes, because that's not a habit, right? That's an event. We want to turn it into a regular ingrained practice. So, yep.
Yeah. And now you've added one more layer, which is not only how frequently will people be practicing those behaviors, but how many times do they have to practice that behavior before it becomes a habit? And they need feedback to make sure that they're doing it correctly. Because how often do you read a book and I read a book and we both interpret something different? Well, right. Yeah. Wow. There's so much more we could talk about here. But this conversation has been super valuable. We've given the audience a process. And of course, our podcast, when it comes out, the micro learning video that will be revealed shortly, it's a place for people to asynchronously ask questions and share. And so if you do have questions or feedback, or you try this on and you're like, I got stuck here, this doesn't make sense, Chris and I are both available to help, because at the end of the day, if we implement processes like these, the learning and development function is ever more valuable. Our jobs are secure. We make the world a better place. Now I can end on a positive note, Chris.
I love it. And we do. This is, I believe that this is our purpose, is to drive change, not to deliver training. So lean into that and take pride in that, because you're doing meaningful work. You're helping people get unstuck. So thanks for being here.
Yeah. Well, thanks for your time, Chris. It was a pleasure.
Likewise.
And there will be more conversations. So everybody stay tuned.